The businessman in seat 12C kept glancing back, his lip curled in disgust every time the child whimpered. Rachel Torres felt her daughter's small fingers tighten around hers as another complaint sliced through the cabin air, loud enough for everyone to hear, sharp enough to make her cheeks burn with shame she didn't deserve. She'd heard it all before. Single mothers shouldn't fly if they can't control their kids, shouldn't take up space meant for real travelers, shouldn't exist in places where their struggles showed. The man beside her hadn't said a word since takeoff, his newspaper folded precisely on his lap, untouched for the past 20 minutes. His posture was too still, his breathing too measured for someone lost in reading. She had no idea he'd been listening to every cruel comment, his jaw tightening with each cutting remark, his knuckles whitening against the armrest. No idea that behind his worn leather shoes and unremarkable appearance, this quiet stranger carried secrets that could change everything. And she definitely had no idea what he was about to do next. What happens when someone running from their own life meets someone fighting just to hold hers together? Jonathan Pierce had chosen seat 14B deliberately, tucking himself into the middle of economy class, where no one would look twice at a man in a faded Oxford shirt and jeans that had seen better days. The watch he'd left in his hotel safe was worth more than most people earned in a year. The private jet sitting idle at the executive terminal could have taken him to Chicago in half the time, in silence, with nobody's problems bleeding into his carefully constructed space. But that was precisely what he was running from. The silence that echoed too loud in empty cabins, the isolation that money had built around him like walls he couldn't scale from the inside. He'd walked past the first-class counter without breaking stride, past the priority boarding lane, past the surprised look of the gate agent who'd clearly recognized him despite his attempt at anonymity. 3 hours in economy, pressed between strangers and their ordinary lives, felt like the kind of penance he needed. Or maybe it was just another way to feel something other than the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. The woman beside him had apologized twice before they'd even left the ground. Once when her daughter's backpack had brushed his arm during boarding, and again when the child had asked in a voice too loud for the confined space if the plane was going to fall from the sky. He'd waved off both apologies with a slight shake of his head, not trusting himself to speak. There was something about the careful way she moved, the practiced efficiency of someone used to taking up as little space as possible, that made him want to tell her she didn't need to shrink herself. But he didn't, because men like him, men whose words carried weight in boardrooms and whose silences could shift markets, had learned that sometimes the kindest thing was to stay quiet and let people be. The girl couldn't have been more than 6, all knobby knees and flyaway hair pulled into a ponytail that listed slightly to one side. She had a coloring book open on the tray table, working on a picture of a castle with fierce concentration, her tongue poking out between her teeth. Every few minutes she'd look up at her mother with something like worry, as if checking to make sure she was still there, still okay, still holding it together. Rachel, he'd heard the name when the flight attendant had come by with drinks, would smile each time, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but seemed practiced enough to fool a child. She had the exhausted look of someone running on fumes and determination, the kind of tired that went deeper than one bad night's sleep. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hands marked with small cuts that spoke of work that wasn't done behind a desk, and she carried herself with the particular wariness of someone who'd learned the hard way that the world didn't offer much grace. The first complaint had come 20 minutes into the flight. The businessman in 12C had twisted in his seat, his voice pitched to carry. Some people don't know how to travel with children. It's inconsiderate. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but the words landed exactly where they were meant to. Rachel had stiffened, her hand moving instinctively to her daughter's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and apologetic. The little girl had only been humming softly, a tuneless melody that wasn't bothering anyone except apparently the man who'd decided to make it his problem. Jonathan had felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar anger he'd thought he'd left behind with the parts of himself that still believed in fighting other people's battles. The second complaint came 10 minutes later, when the child dropped her crayon and it rolled under the seat. "Can't you control her?" The same voice, sharper this time. "This is why children shouldn't fly. Their parents can't manage them." Rachel had bent to retrieve the crayon, her face flushed, and Jonathan had seen her hands shake slightly as she handed it back to her daughter. The little girl had gone very quiet, very still, her earlier joy completely extinguished. She'd pressed herself against her mother's side and hadn't picked up another crayon since. That was what finally made Jonathan move. Not the rudeness directed at the woman, but the way a child's light had been snuffed out by someone who saw her only as an inconvenience. He'd reached into his bag and pulled out his tablet, the one luxury he'd allowed himself on this exercise in ordinary living. Without a word, he'd queued up an animated movie, lowered the volume to a whisper, and angled the screen slightly toward the little girl. Her eyes had gone wide, flicking to her mother for permission. Rachel had looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time, and he'd seen the war playing out behind her eyes, pride that didn't want to accept help, exhaustion that desperately needed it, and something else he couldn't quite name. "It's a long flight," he'd said quietly, his first words to her. "And I've seen this one about 100 times. She'd be doing me a favor." It was a lie, but a kind one, and after a long moment, she'd nodded. The girl had settled in to watch, her small body relaxing by degrees, and the cabin had gone blessedly quiet. Jonathan had gone back to his newspaper, though he still wasn't reading it. He was aware of Rachel beside him in a way he couldn't quite explain, the subtle shift of her breathing as she finally allowed herself to relax, the way her shoulders had dropped from somewhere up around her ears. "Thank you," she'd whispered after a few minutes, the words barely audible over the engine noise. "You didn't have to do that." He'd glanced over, found her looking at him with something that might have been gratitude, but felt more complex. "No one should have to apologize for existing," he'd replied, and then immediately wondered if he'd said too much. But she'd smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine, and something in his chest had shifted in a way he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to remember. They'd fallen into conversation slowly, the way strangers do when trapped in adjacent seats with nowhere else to go. She'd told him she was traveling to Denver to see her mother, who was recovering from surgery. He'd noticed she didn't mention a husband, didn't reference anyone else who might have made this trip with her, who might have shared the burden of a 6-year-old on a cross-country flight. There was a wedding ring on her finger, but it was loose, hanging slightly wrong, as if she'd lost weight and hadn't thought to resize it, or maybe couldn't afford to. He didn't ask. People carried their losses differently, and he'd learned to recognize the shape of grief, even when it wasn't spoken aloud. Instead, he'd asked about Denver, about her mother, safe questions that let her talk without revealing more than she wanted to share. She'd asked what brought him to Chicago, and he'd given her the truth wrapped in a mission, business, meetings that had run longer than expected, the usual. She'd nodded, accepting it, and he'd been grateful she hadn't pushed. Most people didn't, once they decided you were ordinary enough to be uninteresting. That was the gift of traveling like this, of shedding the trappings that made people treat you differently. Here, in seat 14B, he was just another tired traveler who'd been kind to a child. Not Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Pierce Industries, not the man whose quarterly earnings reports moved stock markets, not the billionaire whose face had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times in the past 5 years. Just a man with a newspaper he wasn't reading and secrets he had no intention of sharing. The girl, Zoe, he'd learned her name was, had fallen asleep an hour into the movie, her head tipping sideways against her mother's arm. Rachel had brushed the hair back from her daughter's forehead with a tenderness that made Jonathan's throat tight. There was something achingly familiar about the gesture, something that reminded him of his own mother before she'd passed, before the money had come and changed everything, before he'd learned that success and happiness were not the same currency. "She's beautiful," he'd said, because it felt like something needed to be said, and Rachel had looked down at her sleeping daughter with such fierce love that he'd had to look away. "She's everything," Rachel had replied simply, and he'd understood that she meant it in the most complete way possible, that this child was her entire world, her reason for every sacrifice, every long shift at whatever jobs kept them afloat, every moment of swallowing pride to get through one more day. The businessman in 12C had turned around one more time as they'd begun their descent, his face pinched with irritation. "Finally quiet. About time." Rachel had flinched, her jaw tightening, but she hadn't responded. Jonathan had watched her force down whatever retort had risen in her throat, watched her choose silence over confrontation because she'd learned that people like her didn't win those battles. She'd started gathering their things early, repacking Zoe's backpack with the kind of efficiency that came from doing it too many times, making sure nothing was left behind because replacing lost items wasn't in the budget. The little girl had woken groggy and disoriented, immediately seeking her mother's hand, and Rachel had given it without hesitation, that same protective instinct rising automatically. They'd been among the last to deplane, Rachel taking her time to avoid the rush, to keep Zoe from being jostled in the crowded aisle. Jonathan had found himself walking behind them, not quite ready to let them disappear into the anonymous flow of travelers. He'd told himself it was because they were going the same direction, because it was the natural path to baggage claim. But he knew better. There was something about this woman and her daughter that had gotten under his skin, had reminded him of a version of himself he'd almost forgotten. The boy who'd watched his own mother work 3 jobs, who'd understood what it meant to be poor in a country that pretended poverty was a moral failing rather than a structural inevitability. At baggage claim, Rachel had pulled out a worn envelope from her purse, the kind people use to keep cash organized. She'd opened it briefly, and he'd caught a glimpse of bills, not many, counted and sorted. Travel money, he'd realized, budgeted down to the last dollar. She'd bought the cheapest tickets, packed food to avoid airport prices, planned every expense because there was no margin for error. The weight of it had settled over him, the mathematics of a life where every choice came down to what you could afford rather than what you wanted. He'd spent the past decade in a world where money was a tool that solved problems, where private jets sat waiting and assistants handled details, and the word budget referred to corporate allocations in the millions. He'd forgotten, or maybe deliberately ignored, what it meant to live without that cushion. Zoe had tugged on her mother's hand, pointing toward the restroom. "I need to go, Mama." Rachel had glanced toward the baggage carousel, where their luggage hadn't appeared yet, then back at her daughter. "Okay, baby. We'll be quick." She'd looked around, clearly trying to figure out if she should take all their carry-ons or risk leaving them, and Jonathan had found himself speaking before he'd thought it through. "I can watch your things. I'm waiting for my bag anyway." She'd hesitated, that same war playing out across her face, the need for help versus the reluctance to trust a stranger, and he'd added, "I promise they'll be right here when you get back. Scout's honor." He'd raised 3 fingers in something approximating the gesture, though he'd never been a scout, and she'd laughed despite herself. "Okay," she'd said finally. "Thank you. Really, you've been so kind today." Then she'd taken Zoe's hand and disappeared into the crowd, and Jonathan had stood there with their bags at his feet, wondering what exactly he was doing. This wasn't his problem. This woman and her daughter weren't his responsibility. He had his own life to get back to. his own carefully constructed isolation to maintain. But something about the way Rachel had looked at him when she'd said thank you, as if simple kindness was a gift she hadn't expected to receive, made it impossible to walk away. Not yet. Not until he knew they'd made it safely to wherever they were going, that they'd be okay, that the world would offer them at least one small measure of grace. The bags had come through, and Jonathan had grabbed theirs along with his own. He'd noticed hers was old, the handle wrapped with duct tape to keep it functional, a piece of luggage that had been used hard and repaired because replacing it wasn't an option. When Rachel and Zoe had returned, she'd reached for her bag and her purse in one smooth motion, but the purse hadn't been where she'd left it. Jonathan had seen her face go white, watched the panic slam into her like a physical force. "No," she'd whispered, her hands moving frantically to check pockets, the diaper bag, everywhere the purse wasn't. "No, no, no." Zoe had picked up on her mother's fear, her small face crumpling, and Jonathan had felt something cold and sick settle in his gut. "When did you last see it?" he'd asked, keeping his voice calm even as his mind raced through possibilities. "Just now," she'd said, her voice shaking. "It was right here. I put it here." Her hands were trembling badly now, her breath coming too fast, and he'd recognized the edge of panic threatening to pull her under. "Okay," he'd said firmly. "We'll find it. Let's retrace your steps." But even as he'd said it, he'd known. Someone had taken it. In the brief window when she'd gone to the restroom, when he'd been watching the luggage carousel, someone had seen an opportunity and taken it. The worst kind of theft, from someone who clearly couldn't afford the loss. They'd searched anyway. Jonathan had gone to the airline desk, had pulled strings he hadn't planned to pull, had mentioned his name quietly to the manager who'd appeared suddenly attentive. Security footage would be reviewed, reports would be filed, but the reality had settled over them like a weight. The purse was gone, and with it whatever cash Rachel had saved for this trip, her identification, credit cards if she'd had any, everything that made traveling possible. She'd sunk onto a bench, Zoe pressed against her side, and he'd watched her try to hold it together for her daughter's sake. "It's okay, baby," she'd said, her voice barely steady. "We'll figure it out. It's going to be okay." But her eyes had told a different story, one written in the math of an empty bank account and no way to get where she needed to go. Jonathan had excused himself, stepped far enough away that she couldn't hear, and made 3 phone calls. The first to his head of security, arranging for the footage to be reviewed more thoroughly than airport security would bother with. The second to his assistant, waking her at whatever ungodly hour it was in California, requesting information about medical facilities in Denver and payment arrangements that could be made anonymously. The third to his lawyer, because what he was about to do needed to be untraceable, needed to look like luck or bureaucracy or anything except what it actually was. A billionaire deciding to fix a stranger's life because he couldn't stand to watch it fall apart. When he'd returned to the bench, Rachel had been on the phone with someone, her voice tight. "Mom, I know. I'm so sorry. I'll figure something out, I promise." She'd listened for a moment, then her eyes had filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "I love you too. I'll call you soon." She'd ended the call and sat there staring at nothing, and Jonathan had known he was looking at someone who'd reached the end of her rope and found nothing to grab onto. He'd sat down beside her, careful to leave space, and waited for her to acknowledge him. When she finally looked over, her face was a mask of forced composure that couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. "I need to ask you something," he'd said quietly, "and I need you to hear me out before you say no." She'd nodded, wary. "I travel a lot for work, more miles than I could ever use. I've got hotel points sitting unused, rental car credits that expire if I don't use them, and my company has a relationship with several medical facilities across the country for employee family situations." He'd kept his voice casual, as if this was no big deal, as if he wasn't carefully constructing a lie that would let him help without her realizing the scope of it. I can make some calls. Get you set up with transportation and a place to stay. The medical stuff. I'd have to check, but I think there's a fund for emergency situations. It wouldn't cost you anything, and frankly, I'd be glad to see those benefits go to someone who actually needs them instead of gathering dust in my account. She'd stared at him, and he'd watched her try to process what he was offering, try to find the catch, because there was always a catch. I don't understand, she'd said finally. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. And that was the question he'd been dreading, because the real answer was too complicated, too revealing. Because I'm so tired of having everything and feeling nothing. Because your daughter's smile reminded me what it's like to make someone happy with something simple. Because watching you hold it together while everything falls apart makes me remember that money isn't the only form of strength. Because I've spent 10 years building an empire, and I can't remember the last time I did something that actually mattered. Because someone did it for me once, he'd said instead, which was true even if the context was different. When I was younger, starting out, broke and stupid and way over my head, someone helped me, told me to pay it forward when I could. This is me paying it forward. He'd held her gaze, willing her to believe him, to accept this one kindness from a stranger who would disappear from her life in the next 10 minutes. Please, let me make the calls. Worst case, it doesn't work out, and you're no worse off than you are now. Best case, you get to see your mom, and you don't have to worry about how. Rachel had looked at her daughter, then back at him, and he'd seen the moment she'd decided to trust him. Not because she believed in the goodness of strangers, but because she was out of options, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her mother was waiting. Okay, she'd whispered. Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. He'd smiled, feeling something crack open in his chest, some sealed-off place where he'd stored his humanity. You already have, he'd said. You let your daughter watch my movie. We're even. He'd made the calls right there, stepping away just far enough to keep the conversation private, but close enough that she could see he was actually doing what he'd promised. His assistant had been efficient, asking no questions she didn't need answered, and within 15 minutes he'd had confirmations that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who didn't know how quickly things moved when you had the right resources. A rental car would be waiting, prepaid. A hotel room near the hospital, modest but clean, reserved for as long as she needed it. And the medical bills. Those would be handled through a foundation he'd established years ago for exactly this kind of thing, though he'd never actually used it this way before. Anonymous charitable giving was easy. Looking someone in the eye while you changed their life was something else entirely. When he'd returned to the bench, Rachel had been singing softly to Zoe, some lullaby that probably dated back to her own childhood. The little girl had been fighting sleep, her eyes drooping and snapping open again with stubborn determination. All set, Jonathan had said, keeping his voice light. Cars waiting in the rental lot. Confirmation numbers already in the system under your name. Hotel's about 10 minutes from Denver General. The medical billing department has you flagged for the assistance program. You'll need to stop by their office, but it should be straightforward. He'd handed her a piece of paper with details he'd written down, careful to make it look official, like something that came from a corporate benefits department rather than from him personally. She'd taken the papers with hands that were still shaking slightly, read it twice as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less generous. I don't understand how this is possible, she'd said, looking up at him with eyes that were too bright. This is too much. This is... She'd trailed off, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the moment. He'd shrugged, going for casual and probably missing by a mile. Like I said, unused benefits. Company policy is use them or lose them, and I'd rather see them go to someone who needs them. Besides, I've got 3 more flights this month. I'll rack up enough miles to make up for it. Another lie, but one that served the kindness he was trying to offer without strings attached. Zoe had tugged on her mother's sleeve, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Mama, can we go see Grandma now?" Rachel had looked down at her daughter, then back at Jonathan, and he'd seen her make some internal calculation he'd never fully understand. The weight of accepting help from a stranger, the cost of pride versus the cost of letting her mother down, the complex mathematics of survival that people like him never had to perform. "Yes, baby," she'd said finally, her voice thick. "We can go see Grandma now." Then she'd stood, gathered their bags with Zoe's hand firmly in hers, and turned back to face him one more time. "I don't know your name," she'd said. And there it was. The moment where he could tell her the truth or let the lie stand. "Jonathan," he'd offered, leaving off the surname that would have turned this into something different. She'd nodded, committing it to memory. Rachel Torres, and this is Zoe." The little girl had waved shyly, suddenly bashful now that attention was focused on her. "Thank you, Jonathan. I mean it. You have no idea what this means." But he did, actually. He understood exactly what it meant, because he'd lived it once, in a different form, when his mother had struggled to keep the lights on and food on the table. He'd just been too young then to help, too powerless to fix anything except his own determination to never be that helpless again. "Take care of your mom," he'd said to Zoe, his throat suddenly tight. "She's pretty special." The girl had nodded solemnly, as if he'd entrusted her with a sacred duty, and then they'd walked away toward the exit, Rachel turning back once to wave before they disappeared into the flow of travelers. Jonathan had stood there long after they'd gone, his own bag forgotten at his feet, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. It felt almost like satisfaction, but deeper, more real than the hollow pleasure that came from closing a deal or seeing quarterly profits rise. He'd helped them, actually helped, in a way that mattered, in a way that would ripple forward through their lives. Rachel would make it to her mother's bedside. The medical bills wouldn't bury them. Zoe would have a few more nights of feeling safe and cared for, and he'd done it without needing credit, without strings attached, without turning it into some transactional exchange where his generosity became their debt. For the first time in years, he'd done something that felt genuinely good, and the weight of it was both lighter and heavier than he'd expected. His phone buzzed. His assistant again, confirming the arrangements were in place and asking if he needed anything else. He'd typed back a brief thanks and a note that he'd be off the grid for the rest of the day, then silenced the phone entirely. The meetings in Chicago could wait. The emails piling up in his inbox could wait. Everything that usually demanded his immediate attention suddenly felt less urgent than the strange, fragile thing happening inside him. The reminder that beneath all the money and success and carefully constructed distance, he was still capable of caring about someone else's story. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to feel it, that the sensation was almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. He'd taken a car service back to his hotel, another anonymous transaction that required nothing from him except money. The driver had tried to make conversation, asking about his trip, and Jonathan had given minimal responses until the man had taken the hint and turned up the radio. The city rolled past the windows, Denver in the fading afternoon light, and he'd thought about Rachel and Zoe somewhere in this same sprawl, checking into a hotel room that was probably the nicest place they'd stayed in months, relief washing over them in waves they'd probably crash from later. He'd wondered if Rachel would cry once Zoe was asleep, would let herself feel the fear she'd been holding back all day. He'd wondered if she'd second-guess accepting help from a stranger, if she'd worry about what he might want in return even though he'd asked for nothing. The hotel had felt too quiet when he'd returned to it, his suite too large, the view too expensive to appreciate. He'd stood at the window looking out over the city, at all those lights representing all those lives, and for once he'd actually thought about the people behind them instead of seeing them as abstract economic units, consumers and producers in the vast machine of commerce. Somewhere down there, Rachel was probably calling her mother, telling her they'd made it, that everything was going to be okay. Somewhere, Zoe was probably already asleep, exhausted from the day's drama, dreaming whatever 6-year-olds dreamed about. And here he was, 42 floors up in a room that cost more per night than Rachel probably made in a week, feeling more connected to humanity than he had in the past decade of his carefully curated isolation. He'd ordered room service without looking at the menu, eaten it without tasting it, then spent the evening trying and failing to focus on work. The spreadsheets and reports that usually consumed his attention felt meaningless, the numbers empty of anything except their own mathematical logic. He'd closed his laptop and turned on the television instead, found that same animated movie he'd played for Zoe, and watched it properly this time. It was sweet and simple, and completely unconcerned with the kinds of problems that usually filled his days. The characters wanted things like friendship and adventure and family, things that couldn't be bought or leveraged or optimized. Things he'd lost touch with so gradually, he hadn't noticed their absence until today, when a stranger and her daughter had reminded him what actually mattered. 3 weeks passed before he heard from Rachel again. He'd gone back to California, back to his office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of the bay that cost a fortune to rent, back to board meetings and acquisition talks and all the machinery of building wealth. He'd thought about her occasionally in the quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and he was alone with thoughts he normally kept at bay. He'd wondered if her mother's surgery had gone well, if they'd made it home safely, if his help had been enough, or if some new crisis had already descended. He'd resisted the urge to follow up, to check on them through the channels he could easily access, because that would have crossed a line from kindness into something else, something that looked too much like the control he exercised everywhere else in his life. The letter had arrived at his office, forwarded through his assistant who'd been instructed to screen his personal mail, but had apparently deemed this important enough to pass along. The envelope was simple, the address written in careful handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, and inside was a single page on drugstore stationery. "Dear Jonathan," it began, and he'd felt something catch in his chest just seeing his name in her handwriting. "I've been trying to figure out how to write this letter for 2 weeks now, and I keep starting over because nothing I say feels adequate to what you did for us. My mother's surgery went well. She's home now, recovering, and the doctors say she'll make a full recovery. Zoe asks about you sometimes. She wants to know if you're the kind stranger or a guardian angel, and I honestly don't know how to answer her." The letter continued, and he'd read it slowly, savoring the details she'd shared. How they'd arrived at the hospital just in time, how her mother had cried when she'd seen them, how Zoe had made the nurses laugh with her endless questions, how the financial assistance had come through exactly as he'd promised, how the social worker at the hospital had seemed surprised but pleased that everything was already arranged, how they'd stayed 3 days, and those 3 days had felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. "I called the company you mentioned," she wrote, trying to send a formal thank you, but they said there was no record of the employee benefit program you described. The woman I spoke to was very confused, and that's when I realized what you'd actually done. I don't know who you really are, Jonathan, but I know you're not just someone with unused airline miles." He'd sat back in his chair, the letter still in his hands, and felt simultaneously exposed and relieved. Of course she'd figured it out. She was too smart, too aware, to accept the cover story indefinitely. "I'm not angry," the letter continued, as if she could anticipate his concern. "I'm grateful. and confused, and maybe a little overwhelmed that someone would do something like that for complete strangers. Zoe drew you a picture. It's attached. She says it's you watching movies with her on the plane, but honestly it looks more like a very tall stick figure next to a very small stick figure, so you'll have to use your imagination. I don't expect anything from you. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this, except to say that what you did mattered. It changed everything for us. My mother is alive and healing, and I got to be there with her. And Zoe got to know her grandmother better, and none of that would have happened without you. The drawing was indeed abstract. Two figures sitting side by side with something that might have been a rectangle meant to represent a screen between them. Zoe had colored it in with the kind of enthusiastic chaos that came from being 6 and unworried about staying inside the lines. At the bottom, in careful letters that were clearly copied from something her mother had written, were the words, "Thank you for being nice." Jonathan had stared at it for a long time, this simple piece of art that had required no money to create, but somehow meant more than anything expensive hanging on his walls. He'd pinned it to the board behind his desk, where normally only market reports and corporate achievements lived, and every time he'd looked at it afterward, he'd remembered what it felt like to be seen as just Jonathan, not as the CEO or the billionaire or any of the other titles that defined him everywhere else. He'd written back, keeping his response brief because he'd sensed that Rachel didn't want explanations or justifications. He'd told her he was glad her mother was recovering, that he'd treasured Zoe's drawing, that helping them had meant something to him too, in ways he was still figuring out. He'd signed it simply Jonathan, and included no return address, no way for her to reach him except through the same forwarding system. It felt important to maintain that boundary, to keep this one interaction untainted by the complications that would come if she knew exactly how much wealth he commanded. She'd written back once more, a shorter note this time, just updates on her mother's progress and a story about Zoe starting first grade. He'd kept that letter too, filed it away in a drawer where he stored the few things that actually mattered. Months passed. His life continued in its usual patterns, meetings and deals, expansions and acquisitions, the endless work of maintaining an empire that seemed to grow whether he wanted it to or not. But something had shifted that day in the airport, some fundamental recalibration of his internal compass. He'd started paying attention to the people around him in a way he hadn't before, noticing the custodian who cleaned his office late at night, learning the names of the security guards in his building, actually stopping to talk to his assistant about her family rather than just issuing orders. Small things, probably insignificant in the grand scheme, but they felt like practice for being human again, for remembering that all those people who made his life work were actual individuals with their own struggles and dreams. He'd also started using his foundation differently, moving beyond the impersonal grants and tax-deductible donations to find people like Rachel, individuals who'd fallen through the cracks, who needed help but would never ask for it, who were doing everything right and still couldn't catch a break. His team had thought he'd lost his mind when he'd asked them to set up systems for identifying and assisting people in acute crisis, but they'd done it anyway, because that was what teams did when you paid them enough. The difference was that now he actually read the reports, actually asked about the families they'd helped, actually wanted to know if the money was making a difference in ways that mattered beyond the spreadsheet metrics. It was almost a year later when he'd seen Rachel again, and the circumstances had been so improbable that he'd almost missed her entirely. He'd been in a coffee shop in downtown San Francisco, not his usual haunt, just a place he'd ducked into to escape a rainstorm, when he'd heard a familiar voice ordering at the counter. He'd looked up, and there she was, wearing scrubs this time instead of the worn jeans and sweater from the plane, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, looking tired but somehow more settled than she'd been the last time he'd seen her. She'd been alone, no Zoe in sight, and he'd debated whether to say something or let her go without revealing his presence. In the end, the decision had been made for him when she'd turned from the counter and their eyes had met across the crowded shop. Her face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, something that might have been joy, before settling into a smile that reached her eyes this time. She'd walked over without hesitation, and he'd stood to greet her, suddenly awkward in a way he never was in business settings. "Jonathan," she'd said, his name familiar in her mouth. "I can't believe it's you. What are the odds?" He'd smiled back, feeling that same crack in his chest from a year ago. "Pretty astronomical, actually. Are you living here now?" She'd nodded, gesturing to a table near the window. "Do you have a minute? I'd love to catch you up, if you're not too busy." He'd had 12 things he should be doing, 3 meetings he was technically late for, and an assistant who was probably frantically trying to locate him. "I've got time," he'd said, and meant it. They'd talked for an hour, the coffee growing cold as Rachel had filled in the gaps of the past year. Her mother's full recovery. The decision to move to San Francisco for a better job opportunity. Something in medical billing that paid more and had actual benefits. Zoe thriving in her new school, making friends, losing teeth. All the normal milestones of growing up. She'd found an apartment in a neighborhood that was safe if not fancy, was building a life that felt stable for the first time in years. "That day in the airport," she'd said, her voice dropping to something more serious. "It changed the trajectory of everything. I got to spend time with my mom when it mattered most. Zoe got to really know her grandmother. And I had space to breathe, to figure things out without drowning in crisis. You gave me that." He'd wanted to deflect, to minimize his role, but the look in her eyes had stopped him. This mattered to her, and dismissing it would have been its own kind of cruelty. "I'm glad I was there," he'd said instead, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in months. They'd exchanged numbers this time, actual contact information instead of anonymous letters, and Rachel had made him promise to let her know if he was ever in the neighborhood again. He'd agreed, knowing he probably wouldn't follow through, but wanting to leave that door open anyway. As they'd parted ways on the rainy sidewalk, she'd hugged him briefly, a quick, fierce embrace that had caught him completely off guard, and whispered, "Thank you," one more time before disappearing into the crowd. He'd stood there getting soaked, his carefully pressed suit jacket darkening with rain, and felt more alive than he had in any boardroom that year. He'd started meeting her for coffee occasionally after that, careful to keep it casual, to maintain the boundary between his public life and this private connection he'd stumbled into. Rachel never pushed for more information about who he was or what he did, seemed content to know him as just Jonathan, the man who'd helped her in an airport a year ago. They'd talk about ordinary things, Zoe's latest obsession with dinosaurs, Rachel's co-workers, the challenges of city living on a budget. Sometimes she'd share worries about money or the future, and he'd listen without offering to solve her problems, understanding that what she needed was someone to bear witness to her struggle, not another rescue. It was harder than he'd expected, sitting with someone else's difficulties without immediately trying to fix them, but it felt important somehow, felt like practice for being a real friend rather than just a benefactor. Zoe had joined them once, when school was out and Rachel couldn't find a sitter. She'd remembered him immediately, launching into an enthusiastic recap of everything that had happened since they'd met, barely pausing for breath. He'd listened to her stories about first grade and her best friend and the library book she was reading, and felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. This was what it meant to be part of someone else's life, to show up without agenda, to just be present. The little girl had shown him her latest drawings, still stick figures, but more elaborate now, with backgrounds and details that told whole stories. "This one is you?" she'd said, pointing to a tall figure standing next to 2 smaller ones. "That's me and Mama, and we're all friends." He'd kept that drawing, too, adding it to the collection on his office wall that his executives had learned not to comment on. Rachel had invited him to her apartment once, a small gathering for Zoe's 7th birthday. He'd almost declined, aware that crossing that threshold would change things, would make this connection more real and therefore more complicated. But something in how she'd asked, casual but hopeful, as if his presence would actually mean something to them, had made it impossible to refuse. The apartment had been modest, nothing like the spaces he usually inhabited, but it had been filled with warmth and laughter and actual life in a way his penthouse never managed. A handful of kids from Zoe's class, a few neighbors Rachel had befriended, homemade decorations that had clearly been crafted with more enthusiasm than skill. He'd brought a gift, a set of art supplies he'd chosen himself, not delegated to an assistant, and watched Zoe's eyes go wide with delight when she'd opened it. He'd stayed longer than he'd planned, helping clean up after the other guests had left, washing dishes in a tiny kitchen while Rachel packed away leftover cake. "You didn't have to do this," she'd said, but he'd noticed she hadn't tried to stop him. They'd worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of ease that came from growing familiarity, before she'd spoken again. "Can I ask you something?" He'd nodded, suddenly wary. "Why do you keep coming back? I know you must be busy, must have 1,000 other places you'd rather be, but you show up anyway. Why?" It was the question he'd been asking himself, the one he didn't have a clean answer for. "Because you don't treat me like I'm anyone special. Because your daughter's laugh reminds me that joy doesn't have to cost anything. Because being around you makes me remember who I used to be before success made me afraid of actually living. Because you're my friends," he'd said finally, which was both true and inadequate. "And I don't have enough of those." She'd looked at him with something like understanding, as if she'd heard all the things he hadn't said. "Well, you're stuck with us now," she'd replied, smiling. "Fair warning, Zoe's already planning what she wants for her 8th birthday, and it involves dinosaurs and possibly a bounce house." He'd laughed, feeling something settle into place that he hadn't known was out of alignment. "I'll clear my schedule," he'd said, and meant it more than any business commitment he'd made that year. The moment of truth had come 6 months later, in the most mundane way possible. Rachel had needed someone to watch Zoe for an evening. An unavoidable work obligation, her usual sitter sick, no other options. She'd called him hesitantly, apologizing before even making the request, and he'd said yes without thinking. That evening, sitting on her worn couch while Zoe showed him her homework and chatted about her day, had felt more real than anything in his carefully constructed life. They'd made popcorn in a microwave that was older than some of his employees, watched a movie on a television that was practically vintage, and played board games until Zoe had finally crashed from exhaustion. He'd carried her to her bed, tucked her in the way he imagined fathers did, and felt his throat go tight with something he couldn't quite name. Rachel had come home late, found him still there, and the look on her face had been impossible to read. "Thank you," she'd said quietly, checking on her sleeping daughter before joining him in the tiny living room. "You're good with her. She adores you." He'd shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "She's easy to adore." They'd sat in the dim light of the living room, and he'd felt the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "Jonathan," she'd started, then paused, clearly trying to find words. "I need to tell you something. I know who you are. I've known for a while now. Your face was on a magazine at the grocery store checkout a few months ago. Pierce Industries CEO. Billionaire. All of it." He'd felt his entire body go still, waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the moment when everything would change, when she'd start seeing him differently, treating him differently, wanting things from him the way everyone eventually did. But she'd just looked at him steadily, her expression unreadable. "I don't care," she'd said finally. "I mean, I care in the sense that it explains some things, How you could arrange all that help so quickly. Why you always insist on paying for coffee. But it doesn't change anything about who you actually are when you're sitting in my living room playing Candyland with my daughter. That's the person I care about. That's my friend. The rest is just context. They'd talked deep into the night after that. The whole truth finally laid bare between them. He'd told her about the loneliness of success, about how money had solved every practical problem while creating ones he'd never anticipated, about the isolation of being treated differently everywhere you went, about never quite knowing if people liked you or just what you represented. She'd listened without judgment, without trying to solve anything, and then she'd shared her own truth, about the fear of being seen as a charity case, about the pride she'd had to swallow to accept his help, about building a life where she could stand on her own because she'd learned the hard way that relying on others usually meant getting hurt. "So what now?" he'd asked as dawn had started creeping through the windows. She'd smiled, tired but genuine. "Now you help me move this couch. I've been meaning to rearrange this room for months. And then you stay for breakfast because Zoe's going to be up soon and she'll be furious if she finds out you were here and left without saying goodbye." He'd laughed, surprised by how simple she made it sound. No drama, no declarations, just an invitation to keep being part of their ordinary life. And somehow that felt like the most extraordinary thing anyone had offered him in years.